Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and for this edition of Fresh Red Kills, we're going to be talking about Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. So Fresh Red Kills is just where I talk about the books that I have recently read. And in this case, it is a single book, but a fairly large book. I've also been reading some poetry. You see some of it up there, African poetry. I've made a video about one of those books, and after I'm done with this video, I might make a video about the other one. But those will be things that I'll post for Poetry Thursdays. So this edition of Fresh Red Kills is only going to be one book. Sometimes I talk about multiple books. And I read this along with another booktuber, Mark, over at Book Time with Elvis, and also a booktube commenter, Sonia. She was great to have her along as well. And this is part of the journey that we're taking through Gothic literature, 18th and 19th century in particular. And I would say that this is, without a doubt, the most famous and maybe influential Gothic novel of the 18th or late 18th century, if you don't count The Castle of Otranto, which began the whole movement, arguably. But this one is absolutely famous, began its own style of Gothic, the Radcliffean Gothic, which is the supernatural explained, where things seem like they're haunted or that there's ghosts, but then there's always a rational explanation at the end of everything. And she really kind of began that trend that we see. And we end up seeing Gothic splitting from there, right, into something that's a little bit more terror-centric, like Radcliffe, where you have explained supernatural, something that's a little more horror, and sometimes just genuine supernatural going on. The monsters are real, the ghosts are real. So it's interesting to see where that fork in the road really kind of starts beginning. And I'm speaking to vagaries here. I'm not pretending to be an expert in this at all. This is something that I want to learn more about, and this is the process that I am taking. So this is published in 1794. It's not her first novel, but again, arguably her most famous, and it might not even be her best from what I've read, but we decided to take this one on, especially because famously, Jane Austen ends up parodying this in Northanger Abbey, which she wrote when she was younger, but it wasn't published until later on. But she name checks, I think, Udolpho in that book, as well as some others. And I will comment here that there are some things about Radcliffe that are ripe for parodying. This writing is incredibly melodramatic. The story plot is sometimes fairly absurd. I can see why Austen would have fun with that, but I think people focus too much on Austen parodying it as though she absolutely hated it, and I don't know if that's actually true. Austen was certainly well read in the Gothic. She was widely read in everything of her era, and I don't think that you really parody something unless you have some enjoyment in it. So I see Northanger Abbey as more of a little bit of a loving parody of Radcliffe, and as somebody who is a fan of the horror genre, especially horror cinema, it is very common in the horror genre to parody horror, but in a loving way. It's because everybody knows the tropes and we all have fun with them. So in The Mysteries of Udolpho, it is technically a historical fiction. It takes place in the late 1500s, although you'd be forgiven, especially for the first part of the book, to not get that sense at all. It's split up into 4 volumes. The first volume is the central character, Emily, and her father mostly traveling around the countryside. Very long, languorous passages about travel. And during that time, it feels very much like it's late 1700s England. It's supposed to take place in France at first, and then we end up moving to Italy at a certain part in the book. But it feels very much like I'm reading something from the Regency era or something like that. It feels much more like Jane Austen's time than it does the 1500s. I think that you can buy into the time period a little bit more as the story goes on, especially once you get to Udolpho, because one of the things that is a little bit frustrating about this book, I think, is it's called The Mysteries of Udolpho, and there's certainly many mysteries, but Udolpho is a castle in Italy that you think is going to be the central set piece of this novel, especially because it's named for it. But really, I said it's split up into 4 volumes. It's only in volume 2 and 3 that they're even at Udolpho, and not even for the whole of those volumes. So instead, in that first volume, you have this travelogue with Emily with her sickly father. And again, you have those long passages, long travel passages. We're introduced to a love interest for Emily Valancourt, which I didn't realize that that's what Valancourt Publishing was named after, who publishes Gothic fiction. Now I know what that's named after. So we're introduced to some characters and this love interest. But, it's very much like a kind of slow-moving travelogue. And I kind of get it. Radcliffe, at this point in her life, she had not traveled. So all the things that she was describing were based on travel writing that she had read. And she's very talented at descriptive language. She describes especially mountains and rivers. She loves that mountains and rivers and like waterfalls and rivulets. And I don't think she's ever met one that she didn't want to, wax on poetically about at long length. So we have that, and that can be, for a modern reader, very slow moving. And I mentioned waxing poetic. She also likes to include various poems interjected. And sometimes these poems, they're of varying quality. Some are all right. They feel like major speed bumps in the action sometimes. They don't really add to the plot at all. You could easily skip over them and just keep on going. I read them, but you don't have to. So with those poems and with this languorous pace, especially in the beginning, and also we get it towards the end as well in the 4th volume, this is a bloated book. Of course, this is early on in the life of the novel. She's trying different kind of experimental things, like having the poetry included. People of that time, in the late 18th century England, they certainly would not have minded those long travel passages, even if they didn't move the plot along. This is a time when people didn't travel as much, and also France was still embroiled in the turmoil of the French Revolution, so that would have been a dangerous place to travel to. So to read about parts of France probably would have been very interesting to contemporaries of Radcliffe. But for the modern reader, it's just not nearly as compelling. We do finally get to Udolpho. We get to Montoni, who is the main villain. And that stuff gets more interesting. We do start to get the Gothic finally in volume 2. More mysteries. And that's really where the mysteries come in. Radcliffe throws a lot of mysteries at us. Sometimes an absurd amount. And it's not just mysteries for the central character of Emily to solve. There's also mysteries for the reader to solve. She withholds information from us until the end, just to kind of keep us guessing. Like there's one point where Emily lifts a veil and sees something hideous and grotesque, and she passes out, which she ends up doing a lot, especially at the end. She is not a modern heroine in any sense of the word. But Radcliffe does not let us know what she sees under that veil until the very end. So the reader is left wondering all this. If I touch on Emily real quick, she's very much a passive central character. She is somebody who has things done to her, and nothing she really does moves the plot along very much at all. And especially towards the end, when she is at turns weeping and fainting over and over and over again, and you just kind of want the plot to move forward, she can become a very frustrating character, especially when she's not listening to characters, or there's at one point where she has a chance to solve one of the mysteries, and she just decides to stay home. And so Emily is not one of my favorite female heroines, certainly. And you can kind of say it's a product of the time, but at the same time, Austen was basically starting to write right around this time, and, she would be writing in the decade after, and her characters are wonderfully realized, amazing, female characters in many ways. So, I don't know. I don't know if Radcliffe gets a pass on that, necessarily. So, overall, I did enjoy this book at moments. I think the stuff at the Castle of Udolpho is fine. I think that there are some great passages, actually. There's some fun dialogue. I don't think that characterization is Radcliffe's strong suit. Many of her characters feel like variations on other characters. In the 4th volume, or maybe it's at the end of the 3rd volume, we meet another teenage girl named Blanche, I'm not sure how it's supposed to be pronounced. And she seems very, very similar to everything that we read about Emily. So it feels like we're just meeting Emily over again. And that happens a few times where you're like, this just feels like another character we've already met. But there are moments when the text shines, when it is fun. Is this a text that I would recommend to people? Only for Gothic completionists. I don't see myself saying, hey, you should really check this out. It's a great novel. I think that if you're interested in early Gothic and you are acclimated to writing of the late 18th century, especially, she uses a huge amount of commas. Because, you know, things that we would take parentheses to use these days, she's using commas for. So it can just be incredibly long sentences with comma after comma after comma. And you have to kind of adjust your brain to that. If you're somebody who can do that and you're interested in where Gothic kind of got a major kickstart, I would say, because, yeah, in that case, I would recommend it. I think even if people aren't lovers of the Gothic, I think you have to appreciate it in some ways. It was really one of the very first like major pop culture phenomenons. It was hugely popular in the late 18th century and early 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic, both in the, you know, in Great Britain and in the US. This was a widely read, widely published, widely written genre, and it became very intertextual. Like these texts would almost talk to each other. They would mention each other. Kind of like, again, as a modern horror fan, these, you know, one of the joys of being a horror fan is seeing horror films kind of talk to each other and reference each other. And you see the Easter eggs, you see where the influence comes in, and you started seeing that kind of stuff in the Gothic as well. So it's kind of like the horror fans of the late 18th century were the Gothic readers. So I have a serious soft spot for it. And that's one of the reasons why I was interested in this, and why I'm interested in continuing on through the Gothic, is because I want to see kind of where horror's roots come from. And you see some of that here, but I think that when we get to our next Gothic read, which I believe is going to be Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which was written within a few years after this, I think that'll be probably much more a horror speed in certain ways. That takes the other fork in that road that I was talking about, that, you know, other than what Radcliffe took with the Supernatural Explained. So those interested in early Gothic and those who are okay with reading late 18th century, that's the kind of person I would recommend this for, but not your average reader necessarily. However, I am glad that I read it. I think that both Sonia and Mark, who I read this with, were also overall glad that they read it and that they enjoyed it overall. But I know I need a break from Radcliffe before I read her other stuff. I'm not going to run to her stuff immediately, but maybe down the road I'll go to one of her other novels. But this is, you know, bloated work. It can be a little bit exhausting and trying on the patience at times, but overall, not bad. It's serviceable. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. Thank you, BookTube.